No matter how much gaming has evolved, creating a successful video game sequel has always been tricky. You don't want to change up too little things and keep the game the exact same, you don't want to change too much and alienate the fans you've already established, and going way outside of the original may just mean you lose the old fans and don't even gain any new ones. There were plenty of great original NES sequels, as well as plenty of bad ones, and today we're going to focus on the bad, the top 10 worst NES sequels. Now, these games may not inherently be bad by themselves. In fact, some of these games are actually fun and enjoyable, but for one reason or another, they just didn't live up to the previous game in the series. So without further ado, here are the top 10 worst NES sequels. While it may be mostly dead now, Castlevania evolved greatly over the course of its history, from the 2D linear action games to the experimental 3D titles, to of course the games that got coined Metroidvania with the likes of Symphony of the Night. However, the original NES sequel, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, was a huge departure from the first Castlevania game, going from just straight up linear experience and levels to a giant open world where you could explore various towns, go in multiple different directions, with castles and dungeons to explore, townspeople to interact with, items to buy from shops, upgrades to find, and even leveling up. Castlevania II may have been marred with problems due to the fact of its poor translation, which made things extremely cryptic and difficult to find where you needed to go without being instructed how to do so via magazine or, of course, nowadays via the internet. Castlevania II was a huge experiment and was definitely a misstep in directions when it came to perfecting the Castlevania formula. And while it's still a pretty good game on its own, Castlevania II just didn't quite live up to the hype of the original Castlevania and was definitely overshadowed by the much superior Castlevania III. Paperboy may not be one of the most memorable arcade classics, but it's definitely one of my favorites, and the NES version in particular. They made a sequel that was more of the same, more or less, even adding the addition of being able to play as both a Paperboy and a Paper Girl. But there was some changes to the core mechanics, and you were able to move around a bit more, but this ended up being a bit of a hindrance. Control always felt a bit clunkier compared to the original Paperboy, and while yes, it still maintained that core same arcadey style of action, it just wasn't quite as good as the original title. As many know, I'm a big Mega Man fan, especially of the original series, and while I do love all the games, and there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these 6 Mega Man NES titles, heck, even Rockman Board, the Japanese-only board game for Mega Man, is still a pretty interesting concept. However, while the games were going through their sequels, I found that the evolution of Mega Man kinda stopped with Mega Man 5. At least the previous games changed up things, adding like the charged up Mega Buster, the slide, rush abilities, or just overall had some interesting robot masters and levels for you to conquer. Once you got the Mega Man 5, sure, they added the Robot Bird beat, but for the most part the robot masters were kinda lacking and a bit boring, at least in my opinion. I love Napalm Man though, and his level overall is one of the shining moments in Mega Man 5, but for the most part, I find the Mega Man 5 is the worst of the 6 Mega Man games for the NES. Honestly, I could have put Mega Man 6 in this same place, but there was a few changes, and I do think that it has a better soundtrack than Mega Man 5. One of the weirdest games to get a sequel on this list is Casino Kid. It was a very simple poker and blackjack game that had a JRPG look to it while you're traveling around the casino and interacting with the various people inside of the casino and battling them in poker and blackjack. It was far from the best gambling game available for the NES, but I have a lot of fond memories to it. Years after the original, Casino Kid 2 was released, but it removed one of the things I absolutely loved about the original, which was just the more open environment for you to explore and interact with people. Casino Kid 2 is much more straightforward, and while it still has poker and blackjack, they did add roulette into the mix, but honestly that just ends up being a bit bland in comparison to the 2 other card games, and I don't feel like the game has as much character as the original. They both do poker and blackjack pretty good, but I ended up not really liking the second one nearly as much as I loved the original Casino Kid. While Disney and Capcom on the NES did pretty much no wrong, with maybe the exception of Mickey Mousecapade, the sequels they did for DuckTales and Chip 'n Dale near the end of the NES lifecycle just weren't nearly as memorable. Chip 'n Dale 2 in particular just felt like a lacking game compared to the greatness that was that original game. Sure, the co-op gameplay was back, but the overall feel, the level design just wasn't quite the same, and the over-drawn out cutscenes just didn't really add anything interesting to the mix. Even the soundtrack was definitely lacking in comparison to the first Chip 'n Dale game, and while it still has that same solid gameplay, boss battles tend to drag, whereas in the original it was much more enjoyable to grab the big item and really have a ball, literally speaking, by knocking out all those giant bosses. Overall, Chip 'n Dale 2, if you played just that game, you would think nothing is wrong with it, but if you've ever experienced the original game beforehand, which you probably have, you'll definitely see that Chip 'n Dale 2 just isn't quite the same. Bubble Bobble is one of my favorite games on the NES. Single player or co-op, you can't go wrong, and in fact, of course, you have to play it two-player to get the best ending. The sequel that was made a few years later, and no, I'm not talking about the Rainbow Islands or even Parasol Stars, but the game known as Bubble Bobble 2, which unfortunately was released only to rental stores like Blockbuster, so very few gamers ever even got a chance to mess with it. If you have been lucky enough to try it out, you'll find a much slower and clunkier game. It does look prettier, and it adds the cool addition of actually fighting big giant bosses instead of just one boss at the end, but the fluent movement of Bub and Bob just isn't there. It may have been a little bit difficult to get used to it in the original Bubble Bobble, but moving around and being able to take out enemies and put them into those bubbles and pop them just isn't nearly as fun as it was in the original when you end up playing Bubble Bobble 2. While not called Batman 2, Batman Return of the Joker was the follow-up from Sunsoft to the Tim Burton-inspired Batman game that came out for the NES. Batman Return of the Joker changed up that core action gameplay, making it not nearly as fun or interesting as the original. Gone was the ability to jump and propel yourself off of walls. The difficulty was still very much there, as well as a decent soundtrack, as it still was Sunsoft, and very little times did they ever do anything that was mediocre in the sound department. But Batman Return of the Joker, switching the action to using guns more often than not, and some very, very annoying overall boss fights with some giant health meters that you ended up having to deplete, just made Batman Return of the Joker not nearly as fun or memorable as the one based on the first Batman film. While it may not be as fondly remembered, I loved the first Godzilla game for the NES. It was actually my introduction, for the most part, to Godzilla, who I ended up falling in love with as a character and ended up buying all the VHS tapes I could get my hands on during the course of the early to mid-90s. The first Godzilla game being able to play as Godzilla and Mothra, battling a ton of the various Toho giant monsters, though some of them more memorable than others, and some of them really weren't even in Godzilla to begin with, was still a very cool concept. The controls were slow and clunky, but overall I still ended up enjoying it and it had some great music. Godzilla 2, on the other hand, completely changed up the game. It was now a tactical game where you were playing as the military, trying to move units around and fire at Godzilla and the various other monsters. The sound was just droning at best, and in fact you could turn off the music, but then you ended up turning off all sound effects altogether. The action was controlled by moving your tanks and planes, and then you had to do a slot machine in order to even attack the monsters, making every single battle a very, very slow ordeal indeed. Overall, Godzilla 2, not only is it a bad game, it's a poor sequel, even to a game that was already a relatively poor game. The Simpsons license was always used for some pretty poor games. Bart vs. the World and Bart vs. the Space Mutants were by no means good. but they are brilliant in comparison to Bartman meets Radioactive Man. It took everything that was bad about the previous games and made it worse, with worse controls, worse hit detection, worse action, worse music, and just overall one of the ugliest looking games available for the NES. If you're able to even survive 2 or 3 levels of Bartman meets Radioactive Man, you'll be begging to go back to Bart vs. the Space Mutants and jumping on aliens and decolorizing various objects. Bartman meets Radioactive Man is one of the pinnacles of terrible licensed games for the 8-bit system. Before we get to number 1, let's look at some honorable mentions. I mentioned in my previous top 10 that Star Tropics is one of my absolute favorite games of all time, and the sequel, Zoda's Revenge, is still quite a good game, but the changes to the dungeon movement of giving you more fluidity to your actual movements was a big plus, but also was a big hindrance as well. No longer were you able to kind of know exactly where you were going to land via certain jumps, and it was actually easy to walk off certain ledges in certain areas. Zoda's Revenge not only presented a different style of story altogether, some of which was pretty enjoyable, but other parts just ended up missing the mark, and I missed the tropical feel of the original game. Star Tropics 2 is definitely worth your time, but it just honestly isn't quite as good as the first game. Even though it's one of my top 5 favorite Zelda games, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link changed up the gameplay so drastically that it is overall considered one of the worst games in the Zelda franchise. The gameplay was not only different but much more challenging. They added some awesome additions of magic and being able to level up Link, including not only leveling up but picking what you got to level up, magic, health, or your attack. It had some overall interesting and fun level and dungeon designs and a great soundtrack to go along with it. But being such a huge departure from the first game, it ended up being the black sheep of the family where it still is today. I love Zelda 2, but honestly, it's still not a great sequel overall. Last but not least, and honestly the worst game even being mentioned as far as programming goes on this list, but the game was honestly never officially released, so I really can't fault it all that much. Cheetah Men 2, the sequel to the Action 52 game Cheetah Men, is a game that's not only ridiculously awful, it wasn't even fully finished, with levels that don't even load correctly without glitching things in order to even get to the end, with no actual ending even programmed. The controls are atrocious, with some of the worst hit detections you will ever see on any game in the history of video games. But, like I said, never officially released, so I figured I'd throw it in as an honorable mention, but Cheetah Men 2 is horrendous. Those who know me probably saw this coming a mile away, but Back to the Future 2 and 3 is by far not only one of the worst games of all time and my personal least favorite game on the NES, but also one of the worst sequels. Made by LJN and Beam Software, they outdid themselves when it came to Back to the Future 2 and 3, creating one of the most convoluted messes of a game where you'll have absolutely no idea what you're supposed to do once you're dropped into the world. It has terrible platforming, rip-off enemies that look like they were taken straight out of a bootleg Mario title, and some of the most grinding and annoying music in history. The bird noise alone that you hear every single time a bird enemy appears will cause your ears to bleed to a giant puddle beneath your feet by the time you've played Back to the Future 2 and 3 for only 10 or 15 minutes. I don't think I have to tell you to avoid this title, but make sure there is not a chance that you ever even think about playing Back to the Future 2 and 3. And for those few who have ever beat it like myself, I salute you. So there you have it, the 10 worst NES sequels in my opinion. What are your least favorite sequels for the 8-bit console? Or what is some of your worst sequels of all time? Be sure to comment down below and let me know what other topics or worst top 10s you would like to see in the future. But anyway guys, that will wrap up this top 10. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.